Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. We are here, and we are ready for our fourth. Can you believe it? Number four already. Fourth episode of our retelling of Julius Caesar's The Gallic War. For everyone here today, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. Everyone in the chat, we are streaming this on Twitch right now, as we do on Wednesday nights. I'm sorry, this is the fifth episode, isn't it? I have lied to all of you. This is the fifth episode. Even I have lost how far we've gone. Like I said, we are streaming this on Twitch, so twitch.tv/authorvalentine. If you are watching this on YouTube, these also obviously get uploaded to YouTube in the days following the actual stream. So if you are interested in watching those, well, you know where to find us now. All right. So where were we last time? Let's talk about it here. Julius Caesar has entered into the year 55 BC, and if we remember correctly, he started this whole thing in 58, and his campaign against the Helvetii, the migrating Helvetii tribes and their allies. So 58, we see conflicts between the Romans and the Gauls, namely the Helvetii, and we cannot forget the conflict between the Romans and Ariovistus, the German king of the tribe called the Suebi. And the Suebi were also defeated at the request of the Gauls. And it seemed like for a time that there was a reasonable amount of stability and peace afforded to the region of southern or southeastern Gaul, south of the Belgae, the eastern half of the lands of the Celts, or proper Gaul. However, the next year, the following year, Caesar learned of a great confederation of those Belgae, whom we just mentioned. And the Belgae assembled a host of hundreds of thousands of men, and upon hearing this, Caesar marched out to meet them. Of course he did. That was followed by the previous year, the year we actually just read last week, in the campaigns against the maritime tribes, as Caesar calls it, against the Veneti, as well as the Venelli. And Caesar also mentions the campaigns that occurred against the Aquitani tribes, the tribes of Aquitania. And finally, a brief clash between a general of his called Galba and the Alpine tribes, because he was trying to set up reasonably safe trade routes and also supply chains from Italy to Gaul via the Alps, which was mostly unsuccessful. The legate had to retreat from his position. And so that brings us in to today's episode, to the year 55. By the Roman calendar, this is the year 699. It is the turn of the century, nearly. We're almost in the year 700 by the Roman calendar. The consuls in Rome for this year are none other than Pompey and Crassus. That's right. This is the year of the first triumvirate, the meeting at Lucca, the Lucca Conference, the assuming of power by Pompey and Crassus. This is significant, of course, because if you remember, I believe we mentioned this in the very first stream, Caesar was awarded governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum for 5 years. And by Roman law, he cannot run for consul for 10 years between his last consulship. So he wants to have his command extended for another 5 years so that he can keep his position and not have to return to Rome as a private citizen and face potential trials or arrest by the current leaders in the Senate. This, of course, he gets, but that is a story for another day. So, with that being said, we have a lot to cover today. There's a lot that happens in the year 55 BC. A huge amount. And one of those things is a second invasion of Germans. Let's go over to Gaul 1 here so you can see where we're talking about. The title of this chapter is The Invasion of the Eusepides and the Tencteri. The Crossing of the Rhine, Caesar in Britain. That is a lot of information that's going to be crammed into the next 20 pages of history. So let's go ahead and get down to reading. There's going to be quite a bit to talk about, and I want to make sure we have time to talk about it all. Caesar says, "During the winter which followed, the year of the consulship of Pompey and Marcus Crassus, the Eusepides and the Tencteri, two German peoples, crossed the Rhine with a large host of men, not far from the sea into which the river flows. Their reason for making the crossing was this. For a number of years, the Suebi had been attacking them and making war upon them, and preventing them from farming their land. The Suebi are by far the greatest and most aggressive of all German peoples. It is said that they possess 100 villages, from each of which they take 1,000 armed men every year for waging war outside their own territory. The men who have remained at home support both themselves and those who are abroad. Then the following year, they take their turn under arms, while the others stay at home. In this way, both agriculture and the theory and practice of warfare continue without interruption. There is, however, no private or individual landholding among them, nor is it permissible to remain dwelling in one place for more than a year. They consume little corn, but for the most part live off milk and cattle, and spend much of their time hunting. This activity, together with their diet, daily exercise, and the freedom of their way of life, from childhood they are unaccustomed to duty or discipline, and so do nothing whatsoever against their will, nourishes their strength, and produces men of enormous physical stature. They have, moreover, trained themselves by constant practice, so that however cold the region, they wear no other clothing than skins, which are so small that most of the body is left uncovered, and they bathe in the rivers. They do allow traders access, but rather with a view to having buyers for their spoils of war than because they want anything imported. Furthermore, the Germans do not import for their use any kind of pack horse which the Gauls so delight in and pay high prices for. They take their own native animals, which are deformed and ugly, and by training them every day make them capable of extreme hard work. During cavalry battles, they often jump down from their mounts and fight on foot, for they have trained their horses to remain on the same spot, and then quickly retreat to them in time of need. According to their standards, there is nothing more disgraceful or feeble than using saddles, and so, however few they may be, they will boldly move up to attack any number of cavalrymen on saddled mounts. They forbid the import of wine altogether, believing that it makes men weak and womanish in their capacity for exertion. As a community, they consider it the greatest credit to have as wide a tract of territory as possible next to their borders, as a means of indicating how many states are unable to withstand their strength. Thus, on one side, the land bordering the territory of the Suebi is said to be unoccupied for about 600 miles. On the other, the Ubi are close by. By German standards, theirs is a large and flourishing nation, and somewhat more civilized than the rest of their race. This is because they live beside the Rhine, and traders come to them frequently, and because they are themselves close enough to the Gauls to have become accustomed to their way of life. The Suebi had waged war upon the Ubi many times, but owing to their numbers and importance, had failed to expel them from their land. Nevertheless, they made them pay a tribute and reduced them to a state of greater subservience and inferiority. The Usipetes and Tencteri, whom we mentioned above, were in a similar position. They had endured the aggression of the Suebi for a number of years, but were finally expelled from their land and spent 3 years wandering in many parts of Germany before coming to the Rhine. The Menapi were living in these regions, and had lands, buildings, and settlements on either bank of the river. But they were so terrified by the arrival of this vast host that they evacuated their buildings over the river, and set up garrisons along the nearer bank, and forbade the Germans to cross. The Germans, meanwhile, tried everything, but when they could neither fight their way across because they had no boats, nor cross in secret because of the Menapi's guards, they pretended to return to their own territory and their homes. After 3 days' journey, they turned back. Their cavalry completed the entire return journey in a single night, and attacked the Menapi, who had been told by scouts of the Germans' departure and had confidently returned to their settlements across the Rhine, catching them off guard and unawares. They killed them and seized their boats, then crossed the river before those of the Menapi who were on this side of the Rhine found out what was happening. Then they took control of their buildings and spent the rest of the winter living off the Menapi's provisions. Caesar was informed of this action. He was anxious about the instability of the Gauls, for they are quick to take decisions and ever eager for political change. So he decided not to trust them in anything. For the Gauls make a practice of obliging travelers to stop, even against their will, and of questioning them as to what each one has heard or discovered on every subject. In the towns, a crowd surrounds traders and forces them to declare every place they have come from, and every matter they learned there. These facts and rumors often prompt them to take decisions on matters of great importance, which they are instantly made to think better of. For they are slaves to vacillating rumors, and most men give them answers made up to suit Gallic wishes. When Caesar learned of this practice, he set out to join his army sooner than usual, so as to avoid finding himself confronting a more serious war. Once he joined the army, Caesar realized what he had feared would happen had in fact already occurred. A number of states had sent embassies to the Germans, inviting them to leave the Rhine and promising to procure for them everything they had stipulated. The Germans were encouraged by this hope to roam more widely and penetrate the territory of the Eburones and the Condruzi, who are dependents of the Treveri. Caesar summoned the Gallic leaders, but thought it best to conceal what he had discovered, so he soothed and reassured them, and decided to levy a force of cavalry and to wage war against the Germans. I want to take a small sidebar here and talk about the growing, I guess you could almost call it the growing displeasure that Caesar has for the Gauls that he has dealt with. Let's remind ourselves that this is the 58, 57, 56, 55. This is the 4th year that Caesar has been the governor of 3 provinces and has been absolutely stuck in Gaul because of a growing situation that has essentially grown out of his ability to control it effectively. This all started as simply war against a migrating tribe and then a war against Ariovistus, but through the actions of other tribes, he's been pulled in deeper into kind of the politic of Gaul, and he has essentially become, through these actions, a power broker in the region. So that when something like this happens, like when the Germans cross the Rhine again, and they massacre and take Gallic lands again, it's not the Gauls calling other Gauls for help. They go to Caesar. And you can hear the annoyance, the feeling of oh God, here we go again, in his writing, when he's talking about how the Gauls are susceptible to rumor, that they'll stop traders and they make decisions rashly. They're very prone to political change and wanting almost a natural destabilization of the status quo. And so now he's trusting even those he's supposed to be allied with less and less, and acting on his own more and more. And so he's decided to make war against the Germans for a 2nd time. So let's go back and hear what Caesar has to say. Caesar says, "Once the supply of corn was secured and the levy of cavalry complete, he began the march into the regions where he heard the Germans were located. When he was only a few days' march away, they sent envoys, who made a speech declaring that the Germans had never been the aggressors in waging war upon the Roman people, but they were not refusing to start a fight if they suffered any injury. For the Germans had a custom, handed down from their ancestors, of resisting anyone who made war upon them, and of not suing for peace. They went on to state that they had come against their will after being thrown out of their homes. If the Romans wanted their goodwill, they might find them useful friends. So they concluded the Romans must either give them land or allow them to hold on to whatever they had already won by force of arms. They gave way only to the Suebi, for whom not even the immortal gods were a match. Certainly, there was no one else on earth whom they could not conquer." Caesar made an appropriate reply to this, but his speech ended by stating that there could be no friendship between them and himself if they remained in Gaul. It was not fair that men who had failed to protect their own territory should be occupying other people's land. Nor was there any land in Gaul available to be given out without doing an injustice, especially since they were so very numerous. Even so, if they wished, they might settle in the territory of the Ubi, whose envoys were presently with him, complaining of outrages done by the Suebi and asking for his help. He would issue the Ubi with orders to this effect. The envoys said that they would report back to their own people, and after considering the matter would come back to Caesar in 3 days. Meanwhile, they asked him not to move his camp any closer. Caesar replied that he was unable to grant even that request, for he had learned that several days previously they had sent a large division of cavalry across the Meuse to loot and forage for corn in the land of the Ambivaridi. And he thought that they were awaiting the cavalry's return, and that this was the reason they were proposing a delay. The Meuse flows from the Vosges mountain range in the territory of the Lingonus, and it is joined by a distributary of the Rhine called the Wall, so forming the island of the Batavi. It flows into the Rhine no more than 80 miles from the ocean. The Rhine, however, has its source in the land of the Lepanti, who live in the Alps. For a long distance it flows swiftly through the territories of the Nantuates, Helvetii, Sequani, Mediometrices, Treboci, and Treveri. But when it reaches the ocean, it separates into several channels, thus forming a large number of sizable islands, before it flows from many mouths into the ocean. Most of the islands are inhabited by fierce barbarian peoples, some of which are thought to live on fish and birds' eggs. And I'm going to stop again to talk a little bit about the conversation that happened between the envoys of the Germans and Caesar. So going back to this, the envoys tell Caesar essentially that if he can't find them a place in Gaul, he ought to at least let them keep the land that they have already conquered, and that they could be valuable friends to the Roman people. And Caesar refuses this. And some might say, well, why would he refuse it? That sounds like a good offer. Well, you might remember that not too many years ago, another German king had also had the same offer of friendship with Caesar and with the Roman people. And how did that turn out? Well, it didn't turn out very good, either for the Romans or the Gauls. We've been down this road before, and Caesar knows well where it goes. So Caesar tries to make them a deal. He says, listen, he's very frank. He's basically saying, I don't want you here. And frankly, most of the Gauls don't want you here either. However, if you are willing to go back across the Rhine and come to the aid of the Ubi tribe, who is a German tribe, then we can work out a deal where you can settle in lands over there. He happened to have Ubi envoys with him already. So for Caesar, obviously, this settles the problem of not having Germans on this side of the Rhine, and also having a stronger bulwark against the Suebi. Because despite the defeat of Ariovistus, the Suebi, of course, still pose a serious threat. The Tencteri have been completely displaced. So the Tencteri and the Euseppides have been completely displaced by the power of the Suebi. And it is this continued presence of a very strong German horde that has really forced more people to the west. So let's keep reading. All right. Caesar says, when Caesar was no more than 11 miles from the enemy, the envoys returned to him as had been agreed. They met him on the march and urgently requested him not to proceed further. When they failed to attain this objective, they asked him to send ahead to the cavalry, who were in front of the main column, and order them not to engage, and to grant them permission to send an embassy to the Ubi. They made it clear that if this embassy won the support of the Senate and leading citizens of the Ubi, they would themselves accept the terms Caesar was offering, and asked for an interval of 3 days in which to accomplish these objectives. Caesar was of the opinion that all these suggestions were directed to the same end, namely, securing a delay of 3 days in which their absent cavalry could return. Even so, he declared that he would go no further than 4 miles that day in search of water, and he ordered them to assemble there in full strength the following day, so that he could learn what it was that they were requesting. Meanwhile, he sent messengers to the prefects who had gone ahead with all the cavalry, to tell them not to provoke the enemy into fighting, and if they were themselves provoked, to withstand any assault until they had drawn closer with the army. As soon, however, as the enemy caught sight of our cavalry, which were 5,000 in number, they at once attacked and threw our men into confusion. This was despite the fact that they possessed no more than 800 horse, because those who had crossed the Meuse in search of corn had not yet returned. They were in no way afraid of our men, since their envoys had just recently departed from Caesar after requesting a truce that day. Our men turned to resist them. Then, as was their usual practice, they dismounted, stabbed our horses, pulled a number of our men down, and routed the rest. They caused such a panic among our men that they did not stop running until they came in sight of our column. 74 of our cavalry were killed in that battle, among them a man of outstanding courage called Piso, an Aquitanian Gaul. He was of a wealthy family. His grandfather had obtained royal power in his own state and been called friend by our Senate. He went to the assistance of his brother, who was hemmed in by the enemy, and snatched him from danger. But his horse was wounded, and he was thrown. He fought bravely, so far as he was able, but was surrounded, sustained many wounds, and fell. His brother had already left the battle, but when he saw from far away, he spurred his horse on, exposed himself to the enemy, and was killed. After this battle, Caesar decided not to give audience to any more envoys, or to accept any terms from men who had first sought peace and then had used snares and treachery to make war unprovoked. Indeed, he judged it the height of folly to wait until the cavalry returned and the enemy's forces were enlarged. He knew how unreliable were his Gallic allies, and he was aware how much prestige the enemy had acquired among them as a result of this one battle. He therefore concluded that the Gauls should be allowed no time to hold discussions. These matters were settled, and he had communicated his plans of not letting a day for battle be missed to his legates and his quaestor, when a most timely event occurred. The very next day, a large crowd of Germans, employing the same treacherous hypocrisy as before, called upon all their leading citizens and elders and came into the camp to see Caesar. They claimed that their intention was to make their excuses for starting a battle of contravention of what had been stated and what they themselves had requested. But at the same time, they really intended to use deceit to obtain whatever they could in terms of a truce. Caesar was delighted that they had put themselves in his power and gave orders for them to be detained. He himself led all his forces out of camp. Because he judged that the cavalry had panicked in the recent battle, he ordered it to follow at the rear of the column. He arranged his forces in a triple column, and by completing a 7-mile march, swiftly reached the enemy camp before the Germans could be aware what was happening. They were in a sudden panic at the whole state of affairs. Our rapid approach, the departure of their leaders, and the lack of time to decide on a strategy or take up arms threw them into confusion as to whether it was best to lead their forces out against the enemy or defend their camp, or seek safety in flight. Shouting and running to and fro betrayed their fear. Then our soldiers, goaded by the previous day's treachery, broke into their camp. There those who were able to grab weapons quickly resisted our men for a little while, and gave battle among the wagons and heavy baggage. The Germans had departed from their homes and crossed the Rhine with all their possessions. The crowd of women and children which remained began to flee in all directions. Caesar sent the cavalry to hunt them down. The Germans heard the shouting at their back, and when they saw their people being killed, they threw away their weapons, abandoned their military standards, and burst out of camp. When they reached the confluence of the Meuse and the Rhine, they abandoned hope of fleeing further, and a large number were killed. The rest flung themselves into the river, and they perished, overpowered by fear, fatigue, and the strength of the current. Every one of our men had survived. A few, however, were wounded. They had returned to camp, and this despite their previous anxiety about such a large-scale campaign, and the fact that the enemy numbered 430,000. Caesar gave the Germans whom he had detained in camp a chance to leave, but they were afraid of punishment and torture at the hands of the Gauls, whose lands they had devastated, and declared that they wanted to remain with him. Caesar granted them the freedom to do so. Once the German campaign was over, Caesar decided that for a number of reasons, it was imperative he should cross the Rhine. The most compelling of these reasons was now that he had seen how easily the Germans were induced to invade Gaul. He wanted them to experience fear on their own account. When they realized that the army of the Roman people was both capable of crossing the Rhine and brave enough to venture it. There was also the fact that after the flight of their comrades, the detachment of cavalry of the Usipetes and Tencteri, which I mentioned above, had crossed the Meuse in search of corn and plunder and had not taken part in the battle, had retreated over the Rhine into the territory of the Sugambri, and made an alliance with them. When Caesar sent messages to them to demand the surrender of those men who had made war upon himself and Gaul, they replied that the Rhine marked the boundary of the rule of the Roman people. If Caesar thought it was wrong for Germans to cross into Gaul against his wishes, why was he claiming any rule or power across the Rhine? The Ubi, however, alone of all the peoples across the Rhine, had sent envoys to Caesar and made a treaty of friendship. They had surrendered hostages and pleaded forcefully for him to come to their aid, as they were being harassed by the Suebi. If affairs of the Republic were too pressing to allow him to come, he could just transport his army over the Rhine. That would be enough to help them and bring hope for the future. The fame and reputation of Caesar's army, they went on, was so renowned because of the expulsion of Ariovistus and the war so recently waged against the most distant German nations, that the reputation and friendship of the Roman people could protect them. They pledged themselves to provide a large supply of boats to transport the army. Well, let's take a bit of a sidebar here, and let's talk about what has happened. So, Caesar doesn't trust the Germans. And for a very good reason. They've already crossed the Rhine. It's not like they tried to make a treaty with the Monapi, with whom they were, whose border they were trying to cross. They used a kind of duplicitous method of feigning their return into German lands before suddenly turning back around towards the Rhine once the Monapi had returned to their homes that were on the east side of the Rhine and completely annihilated the Monapi. And for this reason, among others, Caesar says, look, it's too much of a hazard to the stability not only of Gaul but to the Republic itself to have a German horde on the west side of the Rhine, which could potentially just bring in an unending wave of more Germans and by necessity then need to expand out further into Gaul. There's no way this ends positively for anyone involved, so Caesar wants to nip this in the bud as best as possible. Now, he takes, according to himself, he takes the play for time that the envoys are making, the German envoys are making, as duplicitous. He takes it as, or the requests as a play for time and not genuine, because he mentions that the bulk of their cavalry has crossed over the Meuse and is plundering the surrounding territory, Gallic territory, by the way, for food and other plunder, other booty. And so he makes his move, and he attacks, and the attack goes marvelously. He says he didn't lose a single man in the whole operation, which is enormous, because this is a huge battle. Their sheer numbers involved are insane. But because the Romans were able to move in while the Germans were unprepared, they capitalized on this moment and were victorious. Now, some might be kind of shocked to hear about the way in which Caesar treated the German women and children. He said he sent the cavalry to hunt them down. And some people say, well, maybe he's hunting them down to, just capture them and sell them as slaves. But, I mean, that could be, but he's probably killing a fair share too. And so people might rightly say, well, that sounds pretty awful to hunt down the women and children. But there is a strong memory of what the women and children of German ancestry do. And I'm going to read to you a little bit that comes from the account of Plutarch, barely 50 years prior to this, not even 50 years. And this was the invasion of the Cimbri. So this is the Cimbrian War. And this was another Germanic migration that passed through Gaul, ravaged some of Gaul, made subjects of other Gallic tribes, had invaded northern Italy, had defeated multiple Roman generals. Like I said, we've been down this road before, we know where it goes. But at this particular instance, this was the defeat of one of those German armies by none other than Gaius Marius, and that's Julius Caesar's uncle by marriage. That is his aunt Julia's husband. So, let's go ahead and read what exactly happened at the end of that battle with the women and the children, to kind of give you an idea of what would happen during this time. Plutarch says, in this engagement, the greater part of the enemy and their best warriors were cut to pieces. For in order to preserve an unbroken line, those who were fighting in the front ranks were fastened together by long chains, which were passed through their belts. Those who fled were driven back to their fortifications by the Romans, who then were confronted by a most appalling sight. For the women, all dressed in black, stood on the wagons and killed the fugitives, their husbands, their brothers, their fathers. Then they strangled their little children with their own hands, hurling them down under the wheels of the wagons, or the feet of the animals, and finally they cut their own throats. There was one woman, they say, who hung herself from the end of a wagon pole with a child dangling from each ankle, and the men, for lack of trees, tied themselves by the neck to the horns or feet of the oxen, then drove the animals forward with goads, so they were either dragged or trampled to death. Yet in spite of this mass suicide, more than 60,000 prisoners were taken, twice as many as this were said to have been killed. And so we can see that there might be a lack of respect for women and children in this area that we find appalling, but to many of the tribal peoples might have been a matter of course. This is what they will do. And Caesar, you bet he knows this. You bet he does. So let's continue. Caesar has received a request from another German tribe, this time the Ubii. And the Ubii are quite friendly to Caesar. And they say, look, we're also fighting the Suebi. And the Suebi are insane. They're kicking everyone's butts over here. But the Suebi know, just like everyone else, that you defeated one of the greatest Suebi kings, Ariovistus, and destroyed a large German army with your Roman forces. So just having you on the side of the Rhine could ensure our protection just by virtue of the reputation of Roman forces. And this provides Caesar with a reason to go. And also, it's some people will call this a PR stunt. And this is one of the few times I might actually agree with this. He's got a reason to go. He finally has a good relationship with a German tribe who agrees to stay on their side of the Rhine. And he becomes the first Roman general ever to cross the Rhine and to move into the east. That sounds like a good deal. He says, hell yeah, I'll go. And so he does. So let's go ahead and read. The Ubi were asking of him to come across. And let's see what happens. Caesar says, for the reasons which I mentioned, Caesar had determined to cross the Rhine. But as far as crossing by boat was concerned, he judged that it was not sufficiently safe, and he was not convinced that such a method of crossing was in accord with either his own dignity or that of the Roman people. So despite the extreme difficulty of the task of constructing a bridge which lay before him, because the river was so broad, swift, and deep, nonetheless he concluded that he must attempt a crossing by bridge, or not take his army across at all. The plan of the bridge was as follows. Pairs of piles 18 inches thick and sharpened at the end were measured to suit the depth of the river, and joined together with 2-foot gap between them. Rafts and cranes were used to lower the piles into the riverbed, and rams to drive them home, not vertical and straight down like stakes, but lying at an angle, so that they leaned into the current. Opposite these, and 40 feet away on the riverbed, more pairs of piles were joined in the same way, and set at an angled slope, this time against the force and flow of the current. From above, crossbeams 2 feet thick were fitted into the opposing pairs of piles to fill the gap and join them together to form trestles. Twin braces at the ends of each pair of piles kept them apart. Thus, the main piles were arranged in an opposing manner, both held apart and bound together. As a consequence, the structure was extremely secure, and of such a nature that the greater the force of the water pressing upon it, the more firmly its joints were held in position. The trestles were covered over with planks, which joined them lengthways, and also with poles and bundles of rods. Even so, more piles were driven in at an angle further down the stream, to serve as props for the bridge. Attached to the entire structure, they absorbed the force of the current. Finally, more piles were driven in a little way upstream. If the barbarians launched logs or ships to demolish the bridge, these would protect it from being damaged by weakening the impact of such objects. Within 10 days of the materials being gathered together, the entire structure was completed, and the army transported across. Caesar left a strong garrison at either end of the bridge, and set out for the territory of the Sugambri. During this time, envoys from a number of states approached him to ask for peace and friendship. He replied in generous terms, and told them to bring hostages. The Sugambri, encouraged by some of the Tencteri and Eusepides who were with them, had been making ready for flight ever since the construction of the bridge, and now they departed from their own land, carried off all their property, and hid themselves in the isolated parts of the forest. Caesar lingered a few days in their territory, set fire to all their settlements and buildings, and cut down the corn. Then he retreated to the land of the Ubi, when he promised them his help if he were troubled by the Suebi. They gave him the following information. After the Suebi had learned through scouts that a bridge was being constructed, they held an assembly, as was their custom, and then sent messengers in every direction, telling the people to move out of the towns and find shelter for their children, wives, and all the property in the woods. All who were able to bear arms were to assemble in one place, and the place they chose was almost in the center of the territory controlled by the Suebi. They were waiting here for the arrival of the Romans, where they had decided to give battle. By the time Caesar discovered this, he had already accomplished all the objectives for which he had decided to take the army across, namely terrorizing the Germans, wreaking vengeance on the Sugambri, and liberating the Ubi from a blockade. So after spending a total of 18 days on the other side of the Rhine, he judged that he had achieved enough in terms of both honor and advantage, returned to Gaul, and tore down the bridge. Ooh. That is a whole lot of happenings right there. So let's talk a little bit about it. Let me transition over to Valcame so you guys see me. There we go. It's amazing to me how fast this all happens, right? Like, this isn't just a small project. He bridges the Rhine. He builds a bridge across the Rhine, which hasn't been bridged, which is a very wide river. And he does it in 10 days. He's like, yeah, we figured it out. The Germans had offered him boats. They were like, oh yeah, dude, we got boats. You can just get on our boats, we'll ferry you over. And Caesar says no. He's like, we're not getting on your rickety-ass German boats. We say no to German boats. We're Romans here. We don't get on your terribly constructed little rafts that you call boats. We build bridges. And so he goes over. He terrorizes the Germans who were standing against him. He makes allies with some other Germanic tribes. He walks around, and he's told about the Sugambri who are like, oh, they're waiting over there to give battle to you. And Caesar's like, oh, I don't have to fight them. We've already done what we've accomplished. We've already accomplished what we set out to do. Let's go back. And so after 18 days, he's not even there for a month. He's not even there for 3 weeks. He crosses the Rhine. He goes back to Gaul. And that giant bridge, he's just like, oh yeah, tear it down. It took us 10 days. We can always build another one if we need it. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that absolutely incredible? Of course he's going to tear it down. He doesn't want to just have this liability of a giant bridge sitting on the Rhine, so the Germans will be like, hey, who left this here? And then he has to leave a permanent garrison there. Absolutely not. It just amazes me that all this gets done. I mean, think of 10 days to build the bridge, 18 days in Germany. He's there for... This whole process takes a month. And it's over. It's like, okay. Which, I mean, that might sound like a long time to you, but this is in 55 BC, or 54 BC. This is... 55 BC. This isn't exactly modern times, where you have all this technology to build it. These are just Roman legionaries, Roman centurions, Roman engineers, just going at it. These guys knew what to do. So it's good to hear that all of this gets settled so quickly. Which brings us to the third part of this act in this year. Perhaps everyone's favorite part here. And I know you guys are going to love it, because it involves everyone's favorite island in the whole world, Britannia. Ah, yes. So let's talk about Britannia. Caesar says, the campaign season was almost over, and because the whole of Gaul looks northwards, winter comes early in these regions. Despite these facts, Caesar changed his course and set out for Britain, aware as he was that our enemies in almost all our wars with the Gauls had received reinforcements from that quarter. He considered, moreover, that even if the season left no time for a campaign, nonetheless it would be a great advantage to him simply to land on the island and observe the kind of people who lived there, and the localities, harbors, and approaches. Every one of these points was unknown to almost all the Gauls. No one, except for traders, went there as a matter of course, and not even they knew anything beyond the coastline and the areas facing Gaul. Thus, when Caesar summoned traders from every region, he was unable to ascertain either the size of the island, the nature and numbers of the peoples living there, their skill in warfare, their established customs, or which harbors were suitable for a fleet of fairly large ships. Before making the landing attempt, he needed information on all these matters, and he judged it appropriate to send Gaius Volusinus ahead with a warship. He gave Volusinus instructions to make a thorough reconnoiter and return to him as soon as possible. Then Caesar set out with all his forces for the territory of the Morini, from where the crossing to Britain was shortest. He gave orders for ships from the surrounding areas, together with the fleet which he had constructed the previous summer for the campaign against the Veneti, to gather there. Meanwhile, his plan became known, and traders related to the Britons. Then envoys approached him from several of the island's communities. They promised to surrender hostages and to obey the rule of the Roman people. Caesar heard them and made generous pledges, encouraging them to remain loyal to their avowed intentions. Then he sent them home, and with them Commius, a man whom he had made king over the Atrebates after conquering them. He thought highly of Commius's courage and good sense, and believed him to be loyal to himself. Moreover, Commius was thought to possess considerable influence in that area. Caesar ordered Commius to approach what communities he could, urge them to choose loyalty to the Roman people, and declare that Caesar would soon be coming there. Volusinus had spied out the whole area as best he could, considering that he did not dare to disembark and put his safety in barbarian hands. Then he returned to Caesar on the 5th day, and reported what he had observed. While Caesar lingered in this area to make ready his fleet, envoys approached him from the majority of the Morini. They made excuses for their strategy of the previous season, on the grounds that it was because they were barbarians and unaccustomed to our ways that they had made war on the Roman people, and they pledged themselves to carry out whatever Caesar ordered. He considered this circumstance most timely, for he was reluctant to leave an enemy at his back. Also, because the season was so advanced, he had no chance of undertaking a campaign against them. He concluded that involvement in such trivial affairs ought not to come before the expedition to Britain. So he demanded from the Morini a large number of hostages, and as soon as these were produced, he received them under his protection. About 80 transport vessels mustered and collected a number Caesar considered sufficient to ferry 2 legions across. Besides this, he divided up the warships in his possession between his quaestor, legates, and prefects. There were also 18 transport vessels approaching, but a strong wind was holding them back about 7 miles off and preventing them from sailing into the same harbor. He assigned these to the cavalry. He handed over the rest of his army to his legates Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurelius Cotta. They were to lead it against the Menapii, and against those districts of the Morini which had sent to him no envoys. He ordered his legate Publius Sulpicius Rufus to guard the harbor, with a garrison of a size he considered sufficient. These matters settled, he took advantage of a spell of good weather for sailing and weighed anchor around the 3rd watch. He ordered the cavalry to advance to the farther port, embark there, and follow him. They were rather late in carrying out the order, but he reached Britain with the first ships at around the 4th hour. There he spied the enemy forces, fully armed and drawn up all along the cliffs. Such was the geography of this place, and so steep the cliffs which bounded to the sea, that it was possible for missiles cast from the heights to find their targets on the shore. He judged this place wholly unsuitable for disembarkation, so waited at anchor until the rest of the fleet arrived at the 9th hour. Meanwhile, he summoned his legates and military tribunes, and set out what he had learned from Volusinus and what he wanted done. He also warned them that military procedure, and especially naval operations, which tend to be subject to instantaneous and irregular changes, required them to carry out all their tasks at a nod and at the right moment. After dismissing them and taking advantage of a favorable wind and tide together, he gave the signal and weighed anchor. He sailed about 6.5 miles further on and landed on a flat and open shore. The barbarians, however, had grasped the Roman strategy and sent their cavalry on ahead and their charioteers. It is their usual custom to use chariots in battle. They followed on with the rest of their forces and prevented our men from disembarking. This led to extreme difficulties, because the ships were too large to be beached except in deep water, while the soldiers, ignorant of the land, their hands full, weighed down by the size and weight of their weapons, at one and the same time had to jump down from the ships and find their feet in the surf, and fight the enemy. The Britons, on the other hand, were either on dry ground or in shallow water, their limbs unencumbered, the ground very familiar. They cast missiles boldly and spurred on their horses, which were well used to such work. This led to panic among our men, who were wholly unaccustomed to this style of fighting, and thus did not display the same eagerness and enthusiasm as they habitually did in infantry engagements. When Caesar observed this, he gave orders for the warships, which were of a type less familiar to the barbarians and more maneuverable at need, to be moved a short distance from the transport vessels, rowed at speed, and halted on the enemy's exposed flank. From there the enemy could be repelled and driven off with slings, arrows, and artillery machines. This act was of great assistance to our men. The barbarians were thrown into a panic by the appearance of the ships, the movement of the oars, and the unfamiliar machines. They halted and then retreated a short distance. Meanwhile, our soldiers were hesitating, chiefly because the sea was so deep. Then the man who carried the eagle of the 10th Legion appealed to the gods to see that his action turned out well for the legion, and said, "Jump down, soldiers, unless you want to betray our eagle to the enemy. I, at least, shall have done my duty to the Republic and to my commander." He cried these words in a loud voice, then flung himself away from the ship and began to carry the eagle toward the enemy. Then our men urged each other to prevent such a disgrace, and altogether jumped down from the ship. When the men who were on the closest nearby ships saw them do this, they followed them and drew close to the enemy. Both sides fought fiercely. Nonetheless, our men could not keep ranks or get a firm foothold. Neither were they able to follow the standards. Rather, different men from different ships grouped around whatever standard they ran up against, and they were in great confusion. The enemy, however, knew all the shallows, so when they caught sight from the shore of some of our men disembarking one by one, they spurred their horses on, and attacked while our men were still at a disadvantage. There are many surrounding our few. Some began throwing weapons while against a whole group of our men on their exposed side. When Caesar noticed this, he gave orders for the boats of the warships and likewise the scout ships to be filled with soldiers. Wherever he saw men struggling, there he dispatched assistance. As soon as our men stood on dry ground, closely followed by all their comrades, they charged the enemy and routed them. But they could not pursue them very far, because the cavalry had failed to hold its course and reach the island. This was the one action in which Caesar's previous good fortune was found lacking. The enemy had been beaten in a battle. As soon as they recovered from the rout, they at once sent envoys to Caesar to discuss peace terms. They promised to provide hostages and to do whatever he told them. Together with envoys, there came Commius of the Atrebates. I have already described how Caesar sent him on ahead to Britain. When he disembarked and delivered Caesar's demands to them in the role of envoy, they had arrested him and cast him into chains. But when the battle was ended, they sent him back. In seeking peace, they blamed the common crowd for what had taken place, and begged him to pardon their lack of judgment. Caesar complained that although of their own accord they had sent envoys to the Gallic mainland to seek peace, they had then started a war with no reason. Then he declared a pardon for their lack of judgment and demanded hostages. A number of these were surrendered at once. Others were summoned from outlying areas, and they claimed would be handed over in a few days' time. Meanwhile, they ordered their men to return to their lands, and their leaders began to assemble from all directions and commit themselves and their states to Caesar. These acts established the peace. 4 days after their arrival in Britain, the 18 ships which had transported the cavalry and which we mentioned above set sail with a gentle breeze and left their more distant port. When they were drawing near to Britain and were spied from the camp, suddenly a storm arose which was so fierce that not one of the ships could hold her course. Some were carried back to the place from which they had set out. Others, in terrible danger, were swept further down the island's coast, in a westerly direction. They cast anchor, but began to fill with seawater, and were thus forced to sail out to the sea during a stormy night and make for the Gallic mainland. As it happened, there was a full moon that night. On this day, the ocean tides are usually at their highest, a fact of which our men were unaware. So at one and the same time, the tide had flooded the warships by which Caesar had the army ferried across, and which he had beached, and the storm began to inflict damage on the transport vessels, which were fast at anchor. Nor did our men get any chance to maneuver them or bring them assistance. Several of the ships were wrecked. The rest had lost their ropes, their anchors, and the rest of their rigging, and were unfit to sail. The inevitable result was panic throughout the army, for there were no other ships to transport them back, and they had no materials to use for naval repairs. Moreover, since it was generally established that they must winter in Gaul, no corn had been provided for wintering in Britain. Ooh, well, that is a pickle. So now Caesar, let me take a sidebar here, put myself back on the camera. Now Caesar finds himself in the exact opposite position he was in Germany, right? In Germany, he builds a bridge, he goes over, and he accomplishes his goal right away, he goes back. And that's what he was hoping for here. It's late in the season. He doesn't want to be spending a lot of time here. He considers it good enough if he just makes a landing, observes the people, their habits, their cultures, their weapons, their harbors, everything like that, and then goes back. He's not in Britain for the long term. Even the Britons don't want to be in Britain for a long term. Well, maybe they do. So, now this is a pickle because two things have happened that are very important. First, all the ships which carry his cavalry were blown off course twice. In the first crossing with his main army, and in the second crossing that they tried to make, and they came this close, they were in sight of the beach, and then a sudden storm came out of nowhere and blew them back down the coast, and eventually they were forced to return to Gaul. So now Caesar is on an island that no one knows, with no cavalry, no food, and for some of them, no real way back, because the storm also damaged the ships that he had brought. So this has quickly soured for Caesar. So let's see what happens next with the British. Caesar says, once they learned of this, the British leaders who had approached Caesar after the battle held talks among themselves. They realized that the Romans had neither the cavalry nor ships nor corn, and understood from the smallness of the camp their weakness in manpower, circumstances all the more straitened by reason of the fact that Caesar had brought the legions over without their heavy baggage. Thus they considered it the perfect moment to engineer a renewal of hostilities, to cut our men off from corn and supplies, and prolong the action into the winter. They were confident of overcoming our men, or cutting off their escape, and so ensuring that no one would ever cross into Britain to wage war. So they plotted together once more, and began to leave camp, a few at a time, to call their men back in secret from the fields. Even though Caesar had not yet learned of their plans, nonetheless he suspected it would happen, both because of the fate which had befallen his ships, and because the Britons had left off the handover of hostages. So he began to prepare safeguards for every eventuality. Every day he gathered corn from the fields into the camp, and he used timber and bronze from the ships which had been most badly damaged to repair the rest. He gave orders for equipment to be ferried over from mainland Gaul for this purpose. The soldiers carried out these tasks with great enthusiasm, and so by the loss of 12 ships, Caesar was able to render the rest sufficiently seaworthy. While this was going on, the legion known as the Seventh had been sent out in a body as usual to find corn. As yet no hint of hostilities had occurred, since some of the Britons were still in the fields, while others were even making frequent visits to the Roman camp. Then the men on guard at the gates of the camp reported to Caesar that a dust cloud, greater than usual, was visible in the place to which the Seventh had marched. Caesar guessed the truth, that the barbarians had started upon some new stratagem. He gave orders for the cohorts which were then on guard to set out with him to the place, and for 2 cohorts from the remainder to relieve them on guard duty. The rest were to arm themselves and follow him without delay. When they had made their way some distance from the camp, he caught sight of his men being hard-pressed by the enemy, and struggling to hold their position. The legion was crowded together, and missiles were being thrown at them from every quarter. Because all the corn had been cut from the remaining areas, and this place alone was left, the enemy had suspected that our men would come there and had hidden by night in the woods. Then, when our men were scattered and busy cutting corn, he laid down their weapons, and they suddenly attacked, killed a few, cast the remainder into disorder before they could form ranks, and surrounded them at once with cavalry and chariots. Their method of fighting from chariots is as follows. First, they drive around in all directions, casting missiles and generally throwing army ranks into confusion through the panic caused by horses and the noise of the wheels. Then, when they have wormed their way in between the cavalry squadrons, they jump down from the chariots and fight on foot. Meanwhile, the charioteers gradually make their way out of the fighting, and station their chariots so that, if they are hard-pressed by a host of enemies, they have a speedy retreat to their own side. Thus they provide the flexible mobility of cavalry and the stability of infantry in battle. By means of daily practice and exercises, they ensure that even on the steepest of inclines, they can hold their horses at full gallop, control and turn them swiftly, run along the beam and stand on the yoke, and from there get quickly back into the chariot. Because this type of fighting was so unusual, our men were thrown into confusion by such tactics. But in the nick of time, Caesar brought them assistance. For the enemy halted at his coming, while our men recovered from their panic. After this, he considered that it was an inopportune moment for going on the offensive and engaging in battle. So he stayed where he was, and after a short while led the legions back to camp. During these events, all our men were busy, and the rest of the Britons who were in the fields dispersed. Continual storms followed for a number of days, which kept our men in camp and prevented the enemy from fighting. In the meantime, the barbarians sent out messengers in all directions who proclaimed to their own people that our troops were few in number, and declared how great was the opportunity of winning booty and of liberating themselves forever if they drove the Romans from their camp. In this way, a huge force of infantry and cavalry was quickly mustered and approached our camp. Caesar foresaw that the same thing would happen as on previous days, namely that if they were repulsed, the enemy would use speed to escape the danger. Nevertheless, he had in his possession about 30 cavalrymen, whom Commius the Atrebatian, who was mentioned above, had brought across with him. So he stationed his legions in battle formation in front of the camp. Battle was joined. The enemy was unable to withstand the attack of our soldiers for very long and fled. Our men pursued for as far as their vigor and strength allowed, killed a number of them, then set fire to all the buildings far and wide, and returned to camp. On the same day, the enemy sent envoys to Caesar to sue for peace. Caesar doubled the number of hostages which he had previously demanded from them and ordered that they be taken to the Gallic mainland, because the autumnal equinox was at hand, and he considered that as his ships were damaged, the voyage should not be exposed to winter storms. He took advantage of a period of good weather and set sail a little after midnight. All of the ships reached the mainland safely, though 2 of the transport vessels were unable to make the same ports as the rest and were carried further south down the coast. About 300 soldiers had disembarked from these ships and were marching to the camp, when the Morini, whom Caesar had left pacified when he set out for Britain, were led by the hope of booty to surround them with, at first, a small number of men. They ordered that our men lay down their weapons if they did not wish to be killed. Our men, however, formed a circle and began to defend themselves. Then about 6,000 of the Morini massed swiftly on hearing the shout. News of this came to Caesar, who sent the entire cavalry to his men's assistance from the camp. Meanwhile, our soldiers withstood the attack of the enemy and fought bravely for more than 4 hours, receiving only a few wounds and killing several of the enemy. After our cavalry came into sight, the enemy threw away their weapons and turned tail. Many of them were killed. The following day, Caesar sent his legate Titus Labienus with the legions he had brought back from Britain against the Morini, who had renewed hostilities. The marshes which they had used as a refuge in the previous year were too dry to offer a place of retreat, so almost all surrendered themselves to Labienus's control. The legates Quintus Titurius and Lucius Cotta, meanwhile, had led their legions into the territory of the Menapii. There they ravaged the fields, cut down the corn, and burned the buildings, because the Menapii had concealed themselves in the depths of the forest. Then they had returned to Caesar, who established winter quarters for all the legions among the Belgae. In all, only 2 of the British people sent him hostages, while the rest failed to do so. Following receipt of a dispatch from Caesar, a thanksgiving of 20 days was decreed by the Senate for these achievements. And so, the year 55 BC comes to a close. Already, you might say. Already. In just 20 pages, we have gone from a German invasion of Gaul to a Roman invasion of Germany, to a Roman expedition to Britain, and then to a return to Gaul and a small confrontation again with the Belgae. And now things get a little dicey. They get really dicey, if you ask me. Because since the second year of Caesar's command here, he's found himself at odds, in particular with the tribes of the Belgae. Not all of them, remember. One of the tribes, the Remi, who is, if you happen to be looking at the screen right now and you can see the map, Remi is in the south of Belgae, near the border of Celtic Gaul, or Celtica, or however you would like to say it. And the Remi are loyal allies to the Roman people. But as for the others, including the Morini, the Menapi, who... Menapi just can't catch a break, to be honest. The Menapi, if you remember, at the beginning of this chapter, they were mentioned because whose shores did the Germans decide to invade when they came over? Well, it was the Menapi. The Germans came over. They sacked the Menapi cities. They burned down their towns on the east side of the Rhine, and then they crossed the Rhine and completely took over. And now Caesar's like, oh, I don't like them either, and Caesar gets them too. So the Menapi are just, they are everyone's enemy, I guess you could say. Now, Caesar's first expedition in Britain. This was, I think, in all respects, a failure. This is probably the biggest failure of his time in Gaul and the Gallic campaigns. Nothing really comes of it. The landing is somewhat botched. He can't get his forces in because of the weather. He doesn't have the food that he needs, and he can't even get his forces back in a in a proper manner, in a timely manner. So, even though this expedition into Britain was a failure, I think it's fair to say, the fact that it was even attempted and that Romans landed in Britain is in and of itself quite amazing. And the Romans back at home in Italy love this. So much so that a Thanksgiving of 20 days is decreed by the Senate. He didn't win anything. Yeah, it's not like he brought back an enormous amount of booty to Rome, or captured a king, or expanded the territory. He just went there and survived. And that, because Britain at the time was such a mysterious place. They said, what might be there across the English Channel? What could these Britons be hiding? Maybe they have cities of gold. Maybe all their women are the most beautiful in the world. You know, this is what people thought of Britain before they knew the truth. However, this won't be the last time that Caesar goes to Britain. In fact, the title of the next chapter, I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of a teaser right now. Let's read it. It's called The Fifth Book, 54 BC. Or on the Roman calendar, it is the year 700. The consuls are Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus and Appius Claudius Pulcher. And the title of this book is called The Second British Expedition. The Deaths of Cotta and Sabinus. Quintus Cicero against Ambiorix. And Labienus against the Treveri. My hands are already shaking when I'm reading the name, Ambiorix. Oh my lord, it is the greatest traitor in the history of the Republic, Ambiorix. It won't be until the Teutoburg Forest, and then the traitor Arminius encircles and destroys 3 legions that the treachery of Ambiorix will be surpassed. But that will have to wait for next time. That is going to be an exciting read. The siege of Cicero's camp in 54 BC, in the winter of 54/53. I guess it goes into the year 53, probably into January. Is perhaps the single greatest example of gallantry and bravery under incredible odds in the late Republic. People will often talk about Alesia, because Alesia is the great battle that ends the Gallic War. And let me turn on Valcam here so you can see me. Everyone loves Alesia because why? Well, because Caesar built 2 walls, which is cool. I'm not gonna lie. Caesar's victory at Alesia was massive, and it was done in a way that no one would ever thought be done. 2 walls. And he made the Gauls pay for it. But this was Caesar at his greatest might. He had his whole army there. He was fighting a whole Gallic army. And if you compare that to what's about to happen with Cicero against Ambiorix, this is the complete opposite situation. The Romans now are the ones under siege. They're going to be the ones under attack. There's going to be losses. There's going to be pain. But it is the Romans who are going to come out on top. Spoiler alert, I know. I might be spoiling it a little bit, but I'm actually sure everyone knows how the Gallic Wars end, so maybe not. But that was the year 55 BC. We've gone to Britain, we've gone to Germany, and now we return to Gaul. That will be for next week. So next week, again, Wednesday. We do this every Wednesday. Twitch.tv/AuthorValentine. You can join us live for it if you're watching this on YouTube. We'll be doing the year 54. We'll be talking a little bit more about the situation and the people involved, because you're going to be hearing a lot of names next week that are going to sound familiar, including 2 Roman names that are way more popular than they should be, right? Titus Pullo and Lucius Varenus. If you've seen the HBO's Rome series, they're going to be there too. This is their moment to shine. So please look forward to it. Until next time, thank you everyone for joining. If you are watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. I appreciate it. You can always join us on Twitch on Wednesdays. I also stream probably 4 to 5 days a week in the afternoons here in Japan too as well. So feel free to hang out with us then. Thank you again, everyone, for your continued support, and I hope to continue to share the great history of Julius Caesar and the late Roman Republic, in contrast to what the monsters at modern media, this absolute trash heap of... Anyway, it just makes me mad. BBC and Netflix are... But we will fight them. We're not letting them ruin Julius Caesar for you guys. All right. Thank you again so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And I will see you guys next time. You take care. Have a good one.